Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. Members of the City Council of Dublin, Ireland have withdrawn a proposal to rename a park that since 1995 has honored former Israeli President Chaim Herzog. The park, located near Dublin's only Jewish school, is named after Herzog, Israel's sixth president, who was born in Belfast. Here to talk about the now withdrawn proposal is Alexandra Herzog, AJC's director of the William Petschek Global Jewish Communities Department, and Chaim Herzog's granddaughter. Alexandra, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you so much for having me, Manya.
So you have joined us before, but on a different podcast, The Forgotten Exodus, which is our narrative series about Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. You were joining us to talk about your maternal grandfather, Nissim Gaon, the longtime president of the World Sephardi Federation. He came to Israel from Sudan. But this time, we're talking about your paternal grandfather, Chaim Herzog. How did someone born in Ireland later become president of Israel?
Yes, that's a great question, Manya. So my grandfather, Chaim Herzog, was, as you said, born in Belfast. He grew up in Dublin in a very proudly Jewish home. His father actually was Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, and he served as the rabbi of Belfast before becoming the chief rabbi of Ireland. So he moved from Belfast to Dublin in 1919. He was affectionately known as the Sinn Féin rabbi, and he was highly respected and close to many of the leaders of the Irish independence movement. So my grandfather really grew up in a house that was deeply steeped in Jewish learning, in Irish patriotism, and he had a very strong sense of moral responsibility. And as a young man, he had to leave Ireland to study, and he later enlisted in the British Army during World War II. He fought the Nazis as an intelligence officer. He was one of the first soldiers, actually, to enter the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen, and he interrogated senior Nazi officials. Now, after the war, he moved to what would become the State of Israel, and he helped build the very young country almost from its founding in different positions. Then later, he became Israel's ambassador to the UN and a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And by the time he was elected as Israel's sixth president in 1983, he was widely seen really as a statesman who combined Irish warmth and some storytelling with very deep sense of Jewish history and Jewish responsibility. He never stopped describing himself actually as an Irish-born man, and he often spoke about how Ireland really shaped his worldview and his commitment to freedom and to democracy.
And you mentioned that he was the ambassador to the United Nations. He was, in fact, ambassador when the resolution Zionism is Racism was part of the conversation.
That's right, yes. One of the two UN resolutions ever to be withdrawn and canceled. Very important one, that's right.
In fact, if I'm not mistaken, he tore it in half.
He did, saying that this was nothing but a piece of paper, and explained how, we could not equate Zionism to racism in any sort of way.
So were those the reasons why in 1995 the Dublin City Council decided to name the park after your grandfather? Or were there other reasons?
Yeah, I think it was a gesture really of recognition, of pride. Dublin was basically honoring, one of its own, an Irish-born Jew who had gone to become, it's true, a global statesman, the president of Israel, but who really never stopped speaking about his Irish roots. And I think that was really a source of pride for him, but also for Ireland in general for many, many years. And as you said, Herzog Park really sits in a very historically Jewish neighborhood. It's near actually where my family lived, where my grandfather grew up. And it's right next to the country's only Jewish school. So naming a park for my grandfather was, I think, really a way of acknowledging this deep Irish Jewish history and the fact that it is part of Irish history. I think that my family's story is very much woven into the country's broader story of independence, of democracy, and of moral courage, really.
Yet 30 years later, there has been an attempt to rename that park and strip that name from the park. Why? What happened in 30 years?
That's a great question. I think that in the past 3 decades, we've really seen the Israeli-Palestinian conflict become a proxy battlefield for broader political debates in Europe, but also really everywhere around the world. In Ireland, the criticism of Israeli policies, of the Israeli government, has increasingly blurred into hostility towards Israel as a whole, and at times even towards Israelis and towards Jews. What is really striking about this proposal is that it doesn't target a policy or even a government decision within Ireland. It targets a piece of Jewish and Irish history. So instead of creating a new space or a memorial, the proposal really sought to erase an existing Jewish name. And I think that shift from debate to erasure, because that's really what we're talking about, is what worries me the most. It reflects really a climate in which maybe some feel that expressing solidarity with Palestinians require overwriting an important part of Jewish history and Jewish presence, Jewish memory, really. So one of their proposals is actually to rename it Free Palestine Park, or to rename it after, a Palestinian child. Obviously, from a personal perspective, it's extremely problematic to remove a Jewish name to replace it by another group. We don't need to do that. We can recognize the realities and the lived experiences of both groups without having to erase one over another.
I should note that last year, Israel recalled its ambassador and in December closed its embassy in Dublin, accusing the Irish government of extreme anti-Israel policies, anti-Semitic rhetoric, and double standards. So really taking the debate to extremes. And that, in fact, the tiny Jewish community that is still there, about 3,000 people in the Irish Jewish community?
That's right.
They're facing anti-Semitism as well. We actually interviewed our colleague, AJC's Director of International Jewish Affairs, Rabbi Andrew Baker, at the time, just about a year ago, because he also serves as the personal representative on combating anti-Semitism in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So he had just met with the Irish Prime Minister, whose administration had recently adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. So I'm curious now, with this attempt to rename the park and do something so harsh to erase Jewish history, has that definition been implemented or has it failed to be implemented?
Yeah, I think that the adoption of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism by the Irish government was really an important and a very welcome step. On paper, it gives official and institutions, law enforcement, a shared framework, really, for recognizing anti-Semitism, including when it appears in the guise of anti-Israel rhetoric. I think that the challenge, really, as always, is implementation. So from what I hear in conversations with the Irish Jewish community and, Jewish community leaders and colleagues who follow these issues very closely, there's still a significant gap between the formal adoption of the IHRA and the day-to-day practice. Whether it's in, political discourse or in education, or even how incidents are simply discussed or understood. And I think that the current controversy here that we're talking about with Herzog Park is a perfect example of that. If you apply the IHRA seriously, then you see very quickly how targeting a specifically Jewish symbol in a Jewish neighborhood in order to make a political point about Israel actually crosses the line into anti-Semitism. So I think that if we could really work on the implementation much more, that would be extremely positive.
And in fact, the Prime Minister himself actually condemned the attempt by the Dublin City Council to rename the park, correct? He had encouraged the withdrawal of this proposal.
That's correct. Both the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister actually issued statements saying that this proposal should not have come to even be considered and that they should be withdrawn. And I'm very grateful for their leadership in that. And I think that it's important, though, to underline the fact that it is not, just a global form of anti-Semitism, but that it is really an expressed form of anti-Semitism on the ground, really erasing Jewish history and blaming an entire Jewish population for what is happening miles and miles away is anti-Semitism.
So what are you hearing from the tiny Jewish community there? Are you in touch with people there? Do you still have relatives who live in Ireland?
I sadly don't have relatives there anymore, but I am in contact with the Jewish community. And I think that, it's a community that really has a lot of pride in their Jewish history, in their Irish history, and in their Irish roots. I think there is a feeling from what I'm hearing from them that there is a bit of a mix of fatigue also and of anxiety. And we're talking, as we said before, about a very small community, about 3,000 Jews. It's a close-knit community that has contributed far beyond its size to Irish society. They love Ireland and they feel deeply Irish. But in the past years, and especially since October 7, they have felt increasingly targeted, and they often have felt exposed, misunderstood. So I think that incidents like the proposed renaming of the park is like lands in a particularly hard because it's not abstract. It's a park that's in their neighborhood, that's next to their children's school, and bearing the name of someone who for them symbolizes their connection to Ireland. So to see this name singled out really sends a chilling message that, Jewish presence, Jewish history are negotiable.
We talked about similar issues when we talked about your maternal grandfather in Sudan and the erasure of Jewish history across the Middle East and North Africa in these countries where Jews fled. Would you say that there are parallels here, or is that an unfair statement? Is that taking it too far?
I think that in general, the notion of, commemoration, the notion of really talking about one's history is a problematic one when those commemorations or those sort of celebrations of memory, of Jewish memory and Jewish impact are being erased because of the connection with Israel. And when, people use the platform to accuse Israel of genocide, they distort history, they weaponize really Jewish suffering. I think that there is something to be said there. And, it's the same idea as, removing a Jewish name from a park in order to make that political point about Israel. I think that it is something that we're seeing way too much. It is a very slippery slope, and it's something that we should be 100% avoiding because Jewish memory, whether it be, like a commemoration about what happened to Jews from fleeing Arab lands, what happened during the Holocaust, anything that has to do with Jewish memory, it needs to be preserved. It needs to be honored on its own term. It cannot be repurposed or overwritten to serve certain political narratives or even certain political accusations like the ones that we're hearing right now. To me, that is very deeply troubling. And it's something that Jewish communities worldwide, I think, are experiencing more and more, unfortunately.
So I wanted to ask you, your grandfather passed away in 1997. This park was named 2 years earlier. Was he present for that dedication?
Yeah, unfortunately, he wasn't able to attend the inauguration. He was still alive, that's true, and when the park was named, and he was deeply touched by the gesture. I think that for him, it really symbolized a bit of a full circle somehow. The Irish boy who became president of Israel, who's being honored in the neighborhood where his story really began. I think that there was something very powerful and beautiful about it. For the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's birth in 2018, the family actually went to the park and got the dedication plaque up, and that was a very meaningful event.
It must be heartbreaking for you to know that they want to tear that plaque down now.
I know how proud my grandfather was of his Irish roots. I know the work that my great-grandfather did in Ireland for Irish independence. And I think that it's completely uncalled for right now to rewrite history and to pretend that, our family's story has no place in this country that meant so much for 2 generations of my family. And Really, even as a statement for Israel, my grandfather always talked about Ireland and really always had this pride. I think it really gives the very wrong message to young Jews and children who are growing up in a country where they are such a minority. I think that we have to put things in perspective a little bit. And, imagine being a kid and seeing like the name of somebody who maybe symbolizes something for you, their name being removed. It sends a message that really should not be out there in any kind of way and is not justified.
You knew your grandfather. Did he share stories about his childhood?
Yeah, I had the very big privilege to know my grandfather very well, to spend a lot of time with him. He's first a grandchild, so we spent a lot of time together. We shared a deep passion together for history, for literature, for politics, but also for nature. For me, before being a public figure, he really was my grandfather, my Saba, someone who was warm, who was funny, who was very present as a grandfather, who would, take me to the garden and show me all of his fruit trees that he was so very proud of. And I had this feeling, this park is very small. It's a tiny park. But somehow it was so meaningful to him. And I know that he loved living in that neighborhood. It was very hard for him to leave Ireland and, go to what was then Palestine. So it's something that I really felt very strongly when I was there, and that I think that our family thinks about often.
Well, Alexandra, I am so glad that the Dublin City Council tabled this proposal for the time being. I appreciate you sharing some memories about your grandfather and putting this in perspective for our listeners.
Thank you very much. It was an honor.
You can hear the story of Alexandra Herzog's maternal grandfather, Nissim Gayon, and the challenges he and his family faced in Sudan in the first season of our award-winning series, The Forgotten Exodus. In 12 episodes, we also share the erased or often forgotten stories of Jewish families who left or were driven from their homes in the Middle East and North Africa. And don't forget to listen to our most recent series about reconciliation in the region, Architects of Peace, the Abraham Accords story. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.